The room didn't feel hostile, not at first. It was too quiet for that. The kind of quiet that pretends to be professional. Papers aligned too neatly, screens dimmed just enough. Even the air carried that sterile, controlled stillness of decisions already made somewhere else. She noticed it immediately, not the words, those would come later. The pattern. Because after 22 years, you don't just hear conversations, you read structures, you see where pauses don't belong, where eye contact breaks too early, where someone avoids saying the only sentence that actually matters. And today, everything was slightly off. HR smiled, measured, practiced, just a formality. That phrase always arrives before something irreversible. She sat down without rushing, placed her bag beside the chair, smoothed the edge of the document in front of her, not because it needed it, but because it gave her one extra second to observe. No one asked how she was. No one mentioned the years, just the paper, always the paper. A resignation letter, already printed, prepared in advance, waiting. The pen was placed exactly in the center, aligned like it belonged to a process, not a person. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't a conversation, it was a conclusion, delivered early. She looked at the line where her name was already typed, perfectly spelled, perfectly positioned, like she had already agreed, a small detail, but details, she knew, are where control hides. HR leaned forward slightly. We just need your signature. Soft tone, neutral face, but underneath it, pressure, structured, quiet, intentional, because when a system wants compliance, it doesn't raise its voice, it removes alternatives. She didn't answer, not yet. Instead, she read the document fully, every line, every spacing, every word that tried to sound neutral but wasn't. And then she saw it, the absence. No mention of terms, no acknowledgement of conditions, no reference to anything except her voluntary decision. Voluntary. That word hung there longer than it should have, because it wasn't just a word, it was a liability, waiting to be assigned. She exhaled slowly, not in frustration, in recognition, because suddenly the room wasn't quiet anymore. It was loud with intent, and intent leaves traces. She reached for the pen, not to comply, to respond, and in that moment something shifted, subtle, invisible, but irreversible, because what they thought was a signature was about to become a statement. And once written, it wouldn't stay in that room. It never does. The pen felt heavier than it should have, not physically, structurally, because in rooms like this, weight doesn't come from objects. It comes from implication, from what a single action can activate once it leaves your hand. She didn't rush. That alone disrupted the rhythm. HR expected hesitation, maybe discomfort, followed by compliance, a predictable sequence, a clean close. But instead, she paused just long enough to make the silence noticeable, not awkward, precise. Her eyes moved across the document again, slower this time, not reading, mapping, tracking what was said, and more importantly, what was carefully omitted. No termination justification, no restructuring explanation, no mutual agreement clause, just a neatly constructed narrative of choice, voluntary. Again, that word. It sat in the middle of the page like a quiet trap, because if accepted, so it wouldn't just end her role, it would erase context. And context is where accountability lives. She slightly tilted the paper as if adjusting for better light. In reality, she was recalibrating the moment, because after 22 years, you don't react, you position. HR shifted in their chair, a subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but she caught it. That micro adjustment that appears when control isn't progressing on schedule. We understand this may feel sudden, HR added, voice still smooth, still contained. But this is the most efficient path forward. Efficient. Another interesting word. Efficient for whom? She finally looked up. Not confrontational, not defensive, just present, fully aware. And that's when something else became clear. They weren't expecting resistance, they were expecting silence, the kind that signs, the kind that disappears into paperwork, the kind that makes systems look clean, even when they aren't. Her fingers rested on the pen, still not moving, because movement is commitment, and commitment in this room had been pre written for her. But here's the part they miscalculated. She didn't need to refuse. Refusal creates friction. Friction creates attention. Attention invites control back into the room. No, she chose something far more precise alignment, but on her terms. The tip of the pen touched the paper. A small sound, barely audible, but in that silence it landed like a signal. HR relaxed, just slightly. There it was, compliance, or so it seemed. She didn't sign, not yet. Instead, she moved the pen above the printed text and added a line, just one, calm handwriting, no hesitation, deliberate, structured, legally aware. Then she signed, smooth, clean, final. She placed the pen back exactly where it had been, centered, aligned, like nothing had changed, but everything had. HR didn't read it immediately, of course not. Processes like this rely on speed, not scrutiny, on completion, not verification. They glanced at the signature, nodded, and reached for the document. Thank you, they said. And that was the moment the system locked in its assumption. Case closed, file complete, risk eliminated. But what they didn't see, not yet, was that her single line had done something very specific. It didn't reject the process, it redefined it, quietly, legally, irreversibly. Because while they believed they had secured a resignation, she had documented a condition, and conditions, when written correctly, don't stay internal. They travel, they surface, they get reviewed, and when they do, they don't ask who signed, they ask under what circumstances. The room returned to silence, but this time it wasn't controlled, it was pending. And somewhere beyond that office, something had already begun moving. The email left the building before anyone thought to look back at the document. Not dramatically, not flagged, not urgent, just sent. Because that's how real processes move, quietly, through channels no one questions when everything appears complete. She didn't rush to the elevator, didn't check her phone, didn't even look back, because the moment she added that line, the outcome had already detached from the room. What remained inside was just delay. Upstairs, HR logged the file. Standard procedure upload, archive, close. Another case resolved, another clean exit, except there was a pause, a small one, the kind that appears when something doesn't immediately fit into the template. The system flagged a mismatch, not an error, a deviation. The document contained an additional handwritten clause, unregistered, unstructured, outside the expected format. HR frowned slightly, zoomed in, read it once, then again, and this time slower. Because the line didn't contradict the resignation, it didn't reject it. It did something far more precise. It defined the context of signing. Signed under procedural pressure without presentation of alternative employment conditions or negotiated terms. The wording was surgical, not emotional, not defensive, just exact. And suddenly, the word voluntary on the printed page didn't look as stable as it had before. HR leaned back. The room shifted, not physically, structurally, because that one sentence didn't stay within the document. It interacted with it, reframed it. attached conditions that hadn't been accounted for. And systems like this don't ignore conditions, they escalate them automatically. Within minutes, the file moved, not up the usual approval chain, sideways, into compliance, then legal, no alarms, no emails marked urgent, just a quiet rerouting that only happens when something requires interpretation, not processing. 5 hours later, a different room, different table, different tone, no soft smiles here, no just a formality. The document was projected on a larger screen, zoomed in. That line, her line, isolated in the center. No one spoke immediately, because here silence wasn't control, it was analysis. A legal officer adjusted their glasses slightly, scrolled through the document, stopped, returned to the handwritten sentence, read it again, and then, almost casually, opened a reference file. Section 17, Labor Law, not theoretical, not abstract, applicable, current, precise. Coercion in employment termination procedures, they said, voice even, detached. No emotion, just classification. The room didn't react outwardly, but something inside it just recalibrated, because now this wasn't about a resignation. It was about how that resignation was obtained, and more importantly, how it was documented. Another pause, longer this time, measured, deliberate. Was an alternative presented? Someone asked. No immediate answer. Were negotiation terms offered? Silence. Was the employee informed of options beyond resignation? Still nothing. Not because the answers didn't exist, but because they hadn't been recorded. And in this room, if it isn't recorded, it didn't happen. The legal officer closed the file, not abruptly, decisively, and then said the sentence that shifts outcomes without raising volume. Coercion confirmed. No emphasis, no dramatics, just conclusion. And that was it. Because once that classification is assigned, the process doesn't pause, it expands. Notifications, reviews, exposure, not visible yet, but already in motion. Back in the original office, nothing had changed. Same desks, same screens, same assumption of closure, but systems like this don't collapse loudly. They adjust until they can't. And when they reach that point, it's never the signature that matters. It's the line no one expected to be there, the one that redefined everything. And now it was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the process. If you've ever felt that quiet pressure, the kind that doesn't shout but leaves you with no real choice, pause for a second, because moments like this don't always look dramatic. They look procedural. Clean documents, calm voices, standard steps. But behind that, decisions are being shaped. And sometimes all it takes is one line to change who holds control. So tell me, have you ever been in a situation where the outcome was already decided and you were just expected to sign? Drop it in the comments. And if you want more stories where silence isn't weakness but strategy, subscribe. Because what happened next was no longer internal. The notification didn't arrive with urgency. No red flags, no escalation labels, no dramatic subject lines, just a standard internal update. Compliance review, status change, that was the first sign, because in structured systems, language is never accidental. And when something shifts from closed to under review, it means the file has stopped behaving as expected. In the HR dashboard, the case no longer showed as resolved. It showed active, a small detail, but details, as always, carry weight. At first, no one reacted. These things happen occasionally. A document gets flagged, a clause needs clarification. Routine. But then the second notification came. Legal request supporting documentation required. That one lingered longer on the screen because now it wasn't just a deviation, it was a question. And questions in this context demand evidence. HR opened the file again, scrolled, stopped at the handwritten line again, but this time they didn't just read it. They read it alongside what wasn't there. No record of prior discussion, no documented offer of reassignment, no written confirmation of alternatives, just a resignation, now attached to a condition. And that condition had triggered something larger than the room it came from. A request was sent. Please provide documentation confirming voluntary nature of resignation and evidence of presented options. Neutral wording, standard phrasing, but structurally a problem because confirming voluntary now required proof. And proof requires records, records that didn't exist. A meeting was scheduled, not the kind with polite introductions, the kind where laptops open before anyone speaks, where documents appear on screens without explanation, where tone is no longer managed, it's reduced to function. The same document was displayed again. But this time, the focus wasn't on her signature. It was on everything around it. The absence of negotiation, the absence of alternatives, the absence of time, all the things that transform a decision into a process or expose it as something else. Someone from legal leaned forward slightly. Can you demonstrate that the employee had a meaningful choice? The question was simple. The answer wasn't, because meaningful choice isn't implied, it's documented, and documentation is binary. It either exists or it doesn't. Silence followed. Not the earlier kind, not controlled, not polite. This one was heavier because it carried realization. The system they trusted to close things efficiently had just reopened something they couldn't easily contain. HR tried to reframe. This was a mutual understanding, they said carefully, a phrase designed to stabilize, to soften, to reposition intent. But intent without record is invisible. Legal didn't respond immediately, they didn't need to. They simply highlighted the handwritten sentence again, zoomed in, centered, and asked the only question that mattered now: where is the evidence that contradicts this? No one answered, because there wasn't any, and in that moment, the narrative shifted. Not publicly, not yet, but internally, decisively, because now the burden had moved. It was no longer on her to prove pressure, it was on them to prove absence of it. And that's a much heavier position. Another pause, measured, then a quiet conclusion. We proceed with classification. No raised voices, no visible tension, just progression. Because once classification begins, it doesn't reverse. It unfolds, notifications expanded, departments looped in, audit markers applied, not visible from the outside, but inside the system, everything had changed. And the most precise part? She wasn't there anymore. She didn't need to be, because the line she wrote was now doing the work for her, following every step, entering every room, being read by every function that mattered. A single sentence, detached from emotion, attached to process, and process doesn't forget, especially when it's been given something new to remember. By the next morning, the language inside the company had changed, not publicly, not in announcements or meetings, but in the way people phrased things when they thought no one was listening. Make sure it's documented. Put that in writing. Don't assume, record it. Small shifts, but systemic, because once a process gets questioned at the legal level, it doesn't stay isolated. It spreads quietly through behavior. HR wasn't processing exits anymore. They were reviewing them, backtracking, reopening files that had already been marked complete, looking for the same thing they had missed before: evidence, and more often than they expected, It wasn't there. Meanwhile, the case itself moved forward, not faster, just deeper. An internal audit was triggered, standard protocol, which meant timelines were reconstructed, emails reviewed, calendar entries examined, every interaction leading up to that resignation mapped. And what surfaced wasn't dramatic. There were no threats, no raised voices, no explicit pressure, just something more subtle: consistency, meetings scheduled without alternatives, language framed around inevitability, options that were mentioned verbally but never written, a path that narrowed step by step until only one outcome remained. On paper, nothing looked wrong, but when aligned chronologically, it told a different story, one of direction, not choice. And in labor law, that distinction matters more than tone. Back in legal, the classification didn't change, it strengthened, because the handwritten line wasn't standing alone anymore. It was supported not by intention, by absence: absence of contradiction, absence of documented alternatives, absence of proof that the process had been fair. And absence in structured review isn't neutral, it's interpreted. The phrase appeared again in the internal report: constructed inevitability, carefully worded, technically precise, difficult to challenge, because it doesn't accuse, it describes. And once something is described correctly within a system, it becomes difficult to undo. Leadership was informed, not through escalation, through briefing, a controlled summary, facts only, no speculation, no narrative, just a resignation submitted, a condition attached, a legal classification applied, a lack of contradicting documentation, and at the end, exposure risk elevated. That was the first time the weight of the situation became visible. Because risk, once quantified, moves differently. It gets attention, it gets priority, it gets containment strategies. But here's the complication: containment requires control, and control requires leverage. And in this case, leverage had shifted the moment she added that line. Because now the strongest piece of documentation in the entire process was written by the person who had already left. No NDA, no settlement, no structured exit, just a clean document with a precise condition attached, legally aware, time stamped, unchallenged. The company couldn't remove it, couldn't reinterpret it, couldn't override it without creating a second, larger issue. So instead, they adjusted around it, carefully, silently, but the system was already adapting. Templates updated, procedures rewritten, training scheduled, not announced as consequences, presented as improvements, because that's how systems protect themselves. They don't admit fault, they evolve, and yet at the center of that evolution remained one immutable fact: the process hadn't failed, it had been recorded exactly as it occurred, and that recording changed everything. Weeks later, nothing looked broken. From the outside, the company functioned exactly as before. Meetings continued, reports circulated, decisions were made with the same calm efficiency that had always defined the place. But internally, the system had memory now, and memory changes behavior. New resignation procedures appeared, subtle at first: a second confirmation step, a documented offer of alternatives, a required cooling period before signing, not framed as corrections, framed as safeguards. Because no one ever says, "We did it wrong." They say, "We've improved the process." And yet, everyone involved knew exactly where those changes came from. One document, one line, one moment where silence didn't follow the script. Legal closed the case without announcement. No internal broadcast, no formal conclusion shared beyond the necessary departments. just a final status update, resolved with procedural adjustment. Clean, neutral, controlled, but behind that phrasing was something far more specific. The classification remained, the record stayed, the document unchanged. Because once something is entered into a system at that level, it doesn't disappear. It becomes reference, and reference becomes precedent. Months later, during a routine review, a similar case appeared. Different employee, different department, same structure, but this time the process stopped early, paused, reevaluated, not because someone resisted, because the system recognized the pattern and adjusted before it could repeat. That's how influence works at scale, not loud, not visible, but embedded. And somewhere outside all of this, she had already moved on. New role, new environment, no announcements, no statements, no need to explain what happened because the outcome she needed wasn't external. It had already been secured the moment she wrote that line, calmly, precisely, without raising her voice, without refusing, without breaking the structure. She didn't fight the system, she used it. And that's the part most people miss. Control doesn't always belong to the one who speaks louder. Sometimes it belongs to the one who understands where to write. Because in the end, it wasn't the resignation that mattered, not the meeting, not the silence. It was the condition attached to the moment, the detail no one planned for, the sentence that didn't argue, but defined, and once defined, the system did the rest. Silence.